It's time for The World This Week, 7 days for Paris-based correspondents. The World This Week, 1 hour, The World This Week, where we have with us this week Eleanor Beardsley of National Public Radio and Elisabeth Moutet, and Elisabeth Elisabeth, unlike how I misspelled it on Twitter, of the Sunday Telegraph, Craig Kapitis of Bloomberg News, and also with us, freelance reporter Celestine Bolen. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for you for following us and joining in on the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, where our handle here is @FrancoisF24. Now, let's begin, if you will, with the story that's dominated the week's news. Images from this Friday out of Libya. Rebels moving south on the road from Tripoli towards the Gaddafi bastion of Sirte. That town's been given an extra week to surrender. Muammar Gaddafi still out there somewhere. He's been a frequent caller the last few days to a Syrian television station.
The Libyan people have no radios, no telecommunications networks. They can't hear their leader. Why? Because this is dangerous for them. If the Libyan people hear my voice, this is dangerous in the minds of the colonizer and his agents.
However, phrases like "we won't surrender," "we are not women," being met with something of a shrug on the streets of Tripoli.
The big battle in Libya is over, and Libya did not burn. Libya will be rebuilt, and people are happy. And our Eid is doubly joyful because we are now without the frizz head.
Finished now. All Libya is nearly free from Gaddafi.
We will not feel peaceful as 100%, you know, till they catch him. Till now, really, I feel a little bit afraid.
A little bit afraid, Elisabeth Moutet. She'd feel better if he was caught. Remember Saddam Hussein in Iraq? It was over 8 months before the U.S. captured him.
In a hole near Tikrit. And he went to ground in his sort of tribal stronghold, and that's what Gaddafi apparently tried to do, and one of his sons at the very least. It still is over. I mean, basically, you know, when you get pictures of the insurgents in the palaces, and the extremely garish and gaudy palaces where the dictator spent the money of the people, it's basically over. And now it was more a question, as we saw yesterday at the Paris conference, of what do people do to rebuild Libya and to help the Libyans choose a democratic regime.
Craig Kapitis, you agree it's over?
Yes, the caveat emptor is there's nothing more dangerous than weaponized buffoonery, and that's what we're seeing down there. Yeah, it's over for him, but I think there's going to still be some blood spilled, and then the real fight starts for the oil.
We're going to get back to that point in a moment. Eleanor Beardsley, you attended that Thursday conference in Paris. Was it a victory conference? What was the mood like?
Yeah, the mood was ebullient. I mean, the streets of Paris were just blocked all day from, you know, there were cars and limousines with flags from all over the world. And it was really a joyous atmosphere. It was a mob scene, but I happened to be in the courtyard of the Élysée right as the two Libyan leaders
Presidential palace.
Right, walked in. And all of a sudden, you know, this honor guard struck up a tune. They come walking up. President Sarkozy comes out to meet them. And yeah, for the Libyans, for Sarkozy, for David Cameron, it was a proud moment. They need to enjoy it because we don't really know what's going to happen next. But, you know, there they pose before the world's cameras. And yes, they should savor this moment.
Celestine Bolen, let's pick up on the point that Craig made a moment ago and Eleanor about now comes a power vacuum, perhaps?
I mean, I think it's, you know, there are a number of things that are telling and that are worrisome. I mean, one is that the leaders have still not moved to Tripoli. I mean, some of the people are there from Benghazi, but the top leadership isn't in there. I think that's important, not only sort of symbolically, but it obviously, you know, somebody needs to take charge. The city is still grappling with water and electricity shortages. Secondly, I mean, I do think something, you know, troublesome also is that the military commander of Tripoli is, and I'm Abel Hamed Bajar. Anyway, he's
Belhaj.
Belhaj. Sorry, he came from. He was held by the U.S. For a couple of months after he had fled Iraq, where he had been with Al Qaeda in Iraq. I mean, his biography is not simple. It's not clear.
It's that of a jihadist.
It is that of a jihadist. He's saying, no harm intended. I was tortured by the CIA, but I'll be willing to forgive that. But the thing that makes it so complicated is he was liberated, in fact, by Gaddafi's son, which is only to say, I mean, who do you trust in this game would be the first question. And secondly, when do you have to wait to know who you trust? I mean, I just find it interesting that there's sort of certain details, for instance, about him, who named him, how did that happen, that are somehow missing.
And France 24 sat down with Belhaj earlier in the week. He's now been reconverted into the Tripoli military commander for the National Transitional Council, and he predicts rosy things.
We want freedom, justice, and equality for our country. We want a place where everyone's rights will be respected. We want a country that aspires to live in honesty. I hope it will happen soon and in a civil way, and that all social groups will respect each other.
And Elisabeth Mouteh, your reaction to that?
What can you say? I mean, if you have been tortured by one side, whoever liberates you is right at the time it happens. I suppose, we first of all, we have no choice. And second, because we're not going to sort of go and do targeted assassination among the people whom the leadership of the Transitional Council have chosen. And second, it is entirely possible that they actually want to build a free country. It's not sure that, they will not have all demons coming back. But in some ways, Libya was not the stage of a Western grab. It had oil which has sold. In many ways, it's the one actual revolution of the Arab Spring, because if you look at what happened in Tunisia, Tunisia was largely about one elite replacing a leader who was past his sell-by date. Egypt was about the army taking over. It's more of a coup than it really is a revolution, even though you had 1 million people on Al Tahrir Square. Syria is still happening today, and it's nice to see that one despot helps the other and gives him the airwaves. But by and large, Libya may be the actual revolution going on in the Arab world. So, good luck to them.
Right. You mentioned how the rest of the Arab world is watching this. The week began with a border bother between the new team in charge in Tripoli and Algiers, which has taken in Gaddafi's wife, some of his children. The Algerian foreign minister, speaking on French radio on Thursday, insisted this doesn't mean that they'll welcome the man himself.
Il n'a jamais été question.
It was out of the question that Mr. Gaddafi could come knocking on our door. Algeria will not go against international efforts to fix the Libyan problem, and Algeria never has and never will defend Gaddafi.
And on that point, writing in The Independent, Robert Fisk sees Algiers' stance simply as a way of thumbing its nose at the West, letting in part of the Gaddafi family, in particular former colonial power France. But he also points out how regime change can be hard to swallow in places like Algeria. The Algerian tale, its civil war of the 1990s, contained more bloodbaths, 150,000 deaths, mostly civilians, scarcely measures up to the fewer tortures and murders in Gaddafi's Libya. But both governments knew that to retain power meant wielding terrible power. The Arab Spring has really not unfolded so far in the way that people have imagined it. Because remember, in those early days, it was Tunisia and Algeria where there were the first protests.
Right. I mean, I think, it was I was saying the other day, the thing about optimism is it always turns out to be sort of a little bit oversold in these kinds of situations. I mean, even Eastern Europe, even other places where democracy comes in a rush, it's, never an easy process to handle, not to mention when there are lots of young men wandering around with guns. also, as Elizabeth said, I mean, the fact is that in some of these places, was it a revolution? Was it even a spring? Was it just a changeover of one group for another group? You know, these things required some defining as time went by. I think what remains amazing, you know, is a place like Syria where despite all the odds, you know, people are continuing. I mean, the news may not be brilliant in some of the other places, but that's not stopping people going out there and really putting their lives at risk for a change that they think has to happen for the sake of their country.
All right. The other interesting point on this, of course, is that most countries have now recognized the National Transitional Council, including Russia, for instance. However, conspicuously absent at that Thursday Friends of Libya summit we mentioned at the outset in Paris was South Africa's president, Jacob Zuma. And Eleanor Beardsley, it seems as though it's tough to swallow for a lot of people on the African continent.
Yeah, I mean, Gaddafi apparently financed half of the African Union's budget. Maybe not half, but a third. You know, he was building lavish hotels and resorts in South Africa. He was the king of the Africans, is how he proclaimed himself, some sort of Pan-African leader. So, I mean, a lot of people on the African continent, a lot of governments and the people, they liked, or I've been told they respected Gaddafi. So, you know, yesterday I wasn't aware if there were South Africans there or not, but there certainly were the Russians and the Chinese. I mean, you know, they didn't support the NATO actions over Libya, but, you know, I don't think anybody wants to be absent when we're talking about 45 billion barrels of oil reserves. So they got up there quickly. Also, you know, it's in China's interest to keep good relations with Libya. They had to evacuate something like 30,000 workers there. They have big business going on with Libya. You know, you just can't ignore it. So they were there. I assume South Africa is going to come on board eventually, but we'll see when. And I don't think Algeria's quite recognized them either, or they're on the verge of.
You mentioned the oil causing quite a stir in this country. Craig Kapitas, an April 3rd promise that 35% of Libya's crude would go to France. That experts have been debunking that as a boast and not a legally binding document. But there have been words that there have been new deals in the pipeline, so to speak, with, for instance, Italy's Eni, Spain's Repsol. It's all happening.
Is it? Let's wait and see when the oil flows. I mean, you know, obviously, Belhaj, Zuma, you know, this coterie of Algerians, these are quality public servants, well educated in the fine art of diplomacy and, you know, petroleum. You have to see what's going to happen here. Whenever I've covered too many conflict petroleum stories in my career to be anything, to view this as anything, it's cynical. I realize it, but I remember, and I think it's one of those things you can't repeat often enough. The first 3 weeks of the Gulf War, when we were in theater, all we heard from everyone, the diplomats, the soldiers, the spies, the businessmen, was that the oil of Iraq was going to pay for this conflict, and it didn't. And it still remains to be seen what's going to happen.
With all those frozen assets of Gaddafi.
Yeah, it's what's going to happen. And you mentioned the joker in the deck here, and that's the Chinese. The Chinese have a history in Africa over the past 10 years with their vast reserves of hard currency, the largest hard currency reserves in the world, to go to extraordinary lengths to get a hold of raw materials throughout the African continent. They need that energy, and they have the money to pay for it. Indeed, the Chinese just 3 weeks ago, because they look at Zimbabwe as a potential food basket, gave Zimbabwe, I believe the figure was $90 million to create the Robert Mugabe School of Intelligence in Harare. Yeah. So I don't see Hillary Clinton, you know, giving the Libyans $90 million to create, you know, the Belhaj School of Diplomatic Studies.
All right, you talk about paying for the conflict. There's also paying the civil servants in Tripoli. And this was an interesting image from Wednesday evening. A shipment of Libyan dinars printed in the UK and shipped over Wednesday evening by the Royal Air Force to Tripoli. And again, it's the question of the UK and France really owning this conflict, Celestine Boland.
Well, actually, I mean, Juppé actually said it the other day as he was debunking this 35% thing. I mean, he also said, in a sort of an aside, those who supported the new government should probably get, you know, a fair shake, or a fairer shake, I guess is the idea. And I think that's definitely it. I mean, that you know, it's not really, the oil eventually be sold on oil markets. The issue is who gets the construction contracts, and who gets the big, who rebuilds the airport, who, you know, puts up the roads, the railways, whatever. So, you know, clearly the French and the British think they've got, you know, a leg up. But the Italians are not going to let go, because they were always the biggest investors, the biggest, you know, had the biggest and oldest business links, and they'll be right behind. That's not.
And finally, before we go to the break, there's the question of when does NATO pull out of it? And of course, as we mentioned at the outset, Colonel Gaddafi still on the run. We asked you on Facebook and Twitter, do you think that those discrete French and UK special forces that are there should be going after Gaddafi? UK for Justice says, what a joke NATO already is, while Magnus Opus says, yes, absolutely, track the coward down and bring him to justice. War criminal. Yes, oui, Francois. While Kadia says, I think NATO's job is done. After all, in the Libya resolution at the UN, Gaddafi was not a target. Now it's up to the National Transitional Council to find him. While Mr. European says the day before that, says that NATO's mission is to protect civilians only. Your reactions, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, to that. How far should NATO go in helping to track Gaddafi?
I think it's going to be like Laurent Gbagbo in the Ivory Coast and the French troops. The French troops positively did not arrest Laurent Gbagbo, did not take him to the gate of where the Ivoirian troops were, and they did nothing there, and they will not do it again. I think it, you know, there might be a nudge. There might be a nudge in that direction, and that nudge might be very efficient. And officially, I would imagine that Gaddafi will be caught by the Libyan forces.
To me, it's interesting that all the talk about these military specialists, we've actually not seen any.
Our reporters have.
Oh, okay. But I mean, with pictures to go with it. But in any case, it doesn't seem like there are that many. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not talking about a significant force. It's, you know, it's the advisor, you know, quality, capacity.
All right, when we come back, we'll look a little bit at the situation in Syria that we mentioned earlier, and also at France's answer to that UK phone hacking scandal, perhaps. Stay with us.